So I seem to be favouring this more informal kind of chatty style of video at the moment, which I hope you enjoy. Normal programming will resume shortly, but seeing as I'm kind of in the throes of this project and I've had difficulties with my health recently, it's meant I've had to take a bit of a different approach to video making, but that's okay, we adapt. So I'm here today to give you an update on my Relaxed Regency project. So if you haven't seen that video, suggest you click the card now. Hopefully I'm pointing at it. That will take you to the video where I talk about why I started this project and my approach to it. But in short, essentially, from about the beginning of November last year, I became very unwell with my health and I really couldn't get out of bed, essentially. And so I decided that I still wanted to keep sewing, so I adapted and started on a hand sewing project, a historical practice project that I could work on from the comfort of my bed while I was recuperating. As you can probably tell, I'm now doing a bit better. So I'm up and about again, I'm getting dressed and putting makeup on, and I'm also back in the workroom sewing as opposed to being in bed, which means I can do things like use my sewing machine again, I can cut out again. So this project has developed into a partially hand sewn, partially machine sewn project, and I'm okay with that. You know, this is the whole thing. This is what I keep blabbering on about sewing with a disability, is you have to adapt. And if I want to continue with this project and continue to stay motivated and continue to have it be a source of joy in my life, I'm stopping hand sewing it and machine sewing it, because like the thought of just backstitching straight seams now just feels like a waste of energy that I could spend machine sewing it and getting the project finished. In my 2 months in bed, I did complete quite a lot of hand sewing historical practice. So almost all the undergarments, all the undergarments are going to be hand sewn. And I suppose if I get around to making a bonnet as well, that will be hand sewn because that's the nature of millinery. So the dress itself is going to be machine constructed, but hand trimmed. So I thought what I'd do today is do a bit of a review, fill you in, give you some nice close-ups of the work I've done and sort of explain my logic and thinking so that you have a grasp of where I am with this Relaxed Regency project. Let's talk about the shift, or chemise, depending on country of origin and time period. Let's go with shift. So in March, when the pandemic hit, I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to need something to work on to get me through this lockdown period. And I decided I was going to make myself my first ever historical costume outfit. Yeah, that obviously didn't happen. And the reason was I designed and decided I should make an 18th century project before I realised that I don't really like the 18th century. It's just not a period of history that interests me. I'm a Victorianist. I don't really like the clothes. Pastel colours aren't my thing, you know, and sort of that sugary, frothy, frilly 18th century look just doesn't do it for me. So I was kind of like, why am I doing this? And I abandoned the project, and I didn't get any further than sewing the sleeves into this shift. So I cut it, I gored it, I did the hem, I think, I'm not sure. I did most of the construction, and then I put it in the UFO pile with the thought that maybe I'll come back to that 18th century project at some point. And so when I decided on the Relaxed Regency project, I was actually like, oh, I've got a half-made 18th century shift, let's adapt that. So I just felled a few more seams. I hemmed the sleeves to be slightly shorter. You can see it's quite a bulky hem, and that's because I left the excess in so that if I do want to make it an 18th century shift at some point, I can just rehem the sleeves. And the one thing that I procrastinated for the longest time was cutting in the neckline, because I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I didn't know how low my Regency dress was going to be. I didn't know if I was making a high neck sort of Regency pelisse, so I left it. And then eventually what I decided to do was, based on the instructions in the Workwoman's Guide and also some extant examples that are in the collection at the National Trust, I just cut a flap. So it's kind of flops about. The Workwoman's Guide had some instructions that I couldn't decipher about working a buttonhole in the corner and then buttoning it to the stays straps, but I have no idea how, like, the logistics of that, like this, like buttoning it up here or buttoning it here, or like, yeah, I couldn't figure that out. And my stay straps are also quite off the shoulder, and so this wasn't wide enough to reach. The ones in the National Trust have cotton ties on, so I imagine you sort of tie it down like that over the bosom. I'm not sure. So I've just left it flapping around. I rolled hemmed the edges. But yeah, I quite like it. It's really great for filling in the sort of bust cups of the stays, which I'll show you a bit more later, and sort of helping to break up that line in the same way that a corset cover might, I suppose. Definitely adds a bit more sort of froth. And it's also just nice to have the sort of adjustability of, if I do wear something higher neck, I can fill that in, and if I want something lower neck and all that sort of thing. So I don't really have any more to say about that. It's a linen shift. It's pretty bog standard, but it was nice to have a head start on this project, so I could almost dive straight away into the stays, that's for sure. Okay, moving on to the stays. So I had originally intended to make the red threaded Regency stays, and I even made a 12. So I got to the point where I was altering the paper pattern, having done a mock-up, and I thought to myself, this isn't actually going to work for me in terms of accessibility in my body. Firstly, just getting the stays on was a nightmare. So the red threaded stays are back lacing. It's also spiral laced, obviously, at this period. It was just such a struggle to get them on, and I knew that that was not something that was going to be right for me. I was not going to wear them, essentially, if I couldn't get them on. So I knew then I wanted to change my stays, or change the way the stays fasten, essentially, so that I didn't have to wriggle through them over my head. The other thing that I was worried about was, the reality is, if ever I go to a costuming event, if they're allowed to happen at some point in the future, I'm probably going to have to go in a wheelchair, or if not a wheelchair, if I'm mobile enough that I'm going to a costuming event, I'm still going to have to spend quite a lot of the time sitting down. And yeah, the red threaded stays are quite long. They really cut in over the hip. The busk was really long, and you had to kind of sort of do that sitting on the edge of the chair like a Regency lady thing, which is fine, but I don't really have the muscle strength for that. Ooh, you're all right, love. So that was quite exhausting. And I thought to myself, yeah, this just isn't right for me. So I posted about this on Instagram, and I also asked some of our fellow costubers their thoughts and advice about Regency stays, and I got some responses. So the first response I got was from Katie from Latina Living History, and she wears Regency stays often. It's sort of her preferred era of costuming, and she shared with me some research she'd done on her blog about cutting your Regency stays higher in the back than at the front. And she had primary sources for this and extant examples. And so that was originally what I was going to do to my red threaded stays. I was going to eliminate the centre front busk and just cut them higher at the back than they are at the front. But then one of my followers on Instagram, Ollie, thank you very much, Ollie, sent me a link to a blog post from a different blog, which is called Kleidung 1800. Excuse my German English there. So it's a blog in German and English, and it's about Kleidung, clothing, dress from the, early 19th century and the late 18th century, 1800, you get it. The lady who runs the blog, Sabine, she had done some research into a German pattern cutting manual for stays from the end of the 18th century, and as part of her research, she discovered in a museum in Utrecht in the Netherlands a pair of stays that looked like this. They were described as travelling stays or carriage stays, and because they were, firstly, cut longer in the front than they were in the back, but they also had this ingenious wraparound construction so that they fastened in the front, and the original fastens with a hook. I've got ties so that they're more adjustable. And she not only shared all the photographs that she had from the museum on her blog post, but she also made a gridded pattern for us all to enjoy, and she gave instructions for how to draft it to your size as well. So if you're in the market for a free Regency stays pattern, I absolutely recommend it. There will be a link in the description. So yeah, I adjusted it digitally and I printed it out, and I cut my mock-up, which became the lining of these stays, and it fit perfectly, and it was absolutely more suitable for everything that I needed. I could put it on myself without exhausting myself. It was short enough that I could sit down comfortably. It was a really great pattern. I'm so glad I found that. Thank you so much, Ollie. Thank you so much, Sabine. Thank you so much, Katie, for all your help with this. And I'm so pleased with the final stays. They're really comfortable, they're really adjustable, they absolutely give you that correct Regency silhouette. Yeah, the only issue I have is that this section here gapes over this shoulder of mine, and that is just to do with my uneven shoulder blades. I could put a dart in it, I suppose, but meh, who cares? Aesthetics. So in terms of construction, what did I do for these? Not only is this a free pattern, it's also really simple to construct. I put the gussets in, which is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult parts. Particularly, this is quite a heavy, I don't know what you'd call it. It's not quite a coutil, it's not a drill, it's like a corded cotton. It's quite heavy, sort of upholstery cotton or something, and it frayed a lot. So putting the gussets in was quite tricky, but I managed. And that was the first step. But then apart from that, it's just the 2 gussets, the busk pocket, and the side seams, and that's it. That's all the sewing. Of course, you have to do the binding and the ties and the eyelets and things, but it's a really simple construction, so absolutely perfect if you're just starting out. I would definitely recommend this. The only issue I found was particularly with the seam finishing. If I were making a corset or stays from a later period, I would flat fell my seams, or I would do like the double welt fell thing. I can't remember what it's called. But because this was such thick fabric, it didn't really work. So I ended up looking at extant examples of 18th century stays to see what they did with their construction. And quite often they just whipped. And I mean whipped as opposed to fell, with a straight stitch as opposed to an angled stitch, the seam allowance down. So that's what I did. Again, with the binding, I used shop-bought bias binding, cotton bias binding. Is it historically accurate? No. Do I care? No. It looks nice, it looks neat. It was a very efficient and effective way to bind these stays, and I like the way it looks. So I'm okay with that. This is just a cotton herringbone tape. The one thing that I did carry over from the red threaded stays was to have a cord gather up the top, which I wasn't sure was entirely necessary, but then actually with the amount of cleavage that you get with Regency stays, it was really nice to have the ability to sort of draw everything in, let's say. So yeah, I'm really pleased with the stays. This is my first corsetry project for myself, I think. This is my first successful corsetry project for myself, that's for sure. It's really exciting. I'm really pleased with them. They're really comfy, and I'm so grateful that I was able to find a solution to all my issues, really. I've got my busk, so the busk is just a straight busk, which I bought off Etsy from a seller called Silver Hill Historical. There'll be a link in the description, and she custom made this to the correct length for me because obviously I'm not very tall and this is an unusual pattern. You tend to get sort of standard inch lengths for wooden busks like this, but she was kind enough to custom make one for me, which was lovely. So thank you very much, Lizzie, who runs the shop. So that just slides in. The only issue I have really is, you can probably see from the creases, the busk kind of rides up and I get wrinkles here. So I'm not entirely sure how to get it to stay crisp like that. If you know, let me know. So the petticoat, I knew I wanted to make a bodiced petticoat because I think they're more versatile for this Regency era, and also I wanted to do a bodice mock-up for the Laughing Moon pattern because when I got it out and measured it, I was a bit like, this doesn't fit me. So I knew I needed to make a toile, a mock-up. So this is actually an old bed sheet. So I started by cutting out the bodice pieces to the size that the size guide said I should be for Laughing Moon, which is a 14, and I tacked it together just with running stitches by hand and tried it on over the other undergarments, and it was much too big in the bust, but it fit fine in the back. So I should explain, I'm a 36-inch bust, but I'm actually very narrow across the front and much more rounded in the back as a result of my scoliosis. So I often find that I need to have the back pieces much bigger proportionally than the front pieces. So as a result, when I fit it, I actually, I tacked it together and then I adjusted it to fit me, and then I compared it to the original pattern pieces. So the back pieces are still a 14. The front pieces were an 8, but the darts are from the smallest size, the 4. That gives you an impression of just how narrow I am across the front compared to the breadth of my back. So I'm pretty pleased with this pattern as a bodice starting point. I did have to alter it to fit, but then I have to alter everything to fit. So if you are more in proportion than me, it should be fine. Cut the size you expect. For the bodice, I used the Laughing Moon pattern, but the skirt is just a rectangle. I did contemplate like doing a gored skirt, but then that's more seams to backstitch, and I was kind of getting a bit done with the hand sewing at this point. So it's just a rectangle, and then I knife pleated it into the back. And of course I did, I think this is a mantua maker stitch, or maybe it's a run and fell stitch, I'm not sure, to do the centre back seam. So obviously I've got it left open quite a long way here. One of the things about this Laughing Moon pattern is there's no skirt placket, which is kind of weird in my opinion. Apparently it's historically accurate, so let's go with it, but it's annoying. I don't like it. So there are two options. Obviously it doesn't quite fit to my dress form, but you can cut the bodice back to overlap slightly and do buttons and buttonholes, or hooks and bars, or whatever takes your fancy, or you can have it meet edge to edge and tie with ribbons, which is apparently what a lot of Regency gowns do. They just have ribbon ties, they just meet edge to edge, and as a result the skirt just meets edge to edge, and you can kind of see I have turned and felled in edges, but the raw edges are kind of hidden in the pleats. So that's the idea, is that when it's closed like that, it's not going to gape open because you've got all the excess of the pleats. However, I don't like that. So on my real thing, I think I will include a placket. You also then end up in a position where if you do want the bodice to overlap, the skirt doesn't. The skirts still finish at the centre black backline, and then you have the extension which just kind of flaps around, and then I don't know, it's odd. So on my real skirt, I think I'll add a placket. Maybe that will make it less historically accurate, but to be honest, I'm going to be overlooking it and machine sewing it anyway, so I'm not really bothered about that. One thing I did, however, is I think I got my measurements wrong. I thought I'd cut something. This is the thing, I wasn't particularly with it, so don't know if basically I made the skirt much too long, like hilariously too long, like at least half a meter too long. I knew I wanted a corded hem and I knew I wanted tucks, and so because this was a flat bed sheet, I actually kind of cheated, I left in the machine hem that the sheet came with on one of the raw edges, and I used that as my hem, and I just ran a cord through it because I did not feel like backstitching a cord into the hem of this petticoat at that point. So I stitched in my tucks and I did my petticoat, and then I tried it on still, and it was just like, even with the tucks, it was much too long. So I actually had to rip out the petticoat bodice at the waist seam and then take it apart, chop however many centimeters it was off, 50 centimeters, and then re-pleat it, attach it to the bodice, which was kind of annoying, but it was definitely quicker than chopping off all the tucks I'd already sewn in and the corded hem and having to redo that. That was one of the things about doing the hand sewing that got me. It's so frustrating to have hand stitched something in, it's taken hours, and then it turns out you've done it wrong and you have to unpick it all and hand stitch it again. It's just like, really frustrating, and I don't really have the patience for that. So hence why I'm moving back to my machine. Generally, I'm really pleased with my petticoat. It fits nice and snugly over the stays, but it also fits without the stays, because that is also a historically accurate option for the Regency era. You don't actually need stays. Shh, don't tell anybody. Particularly if you're doing like the first few years of the 1800s. I'm glad I made this piece because I think it's actually going to be really versatile as a costuming piece. I'm also glad I made it adjustable with the ties because bodies change, and so having adjustable clothes is nice, you get more wear out of them. Something I haven't talked about is the way I finished the armholes and the neck. I bought modern cotton bias binding and stitched it on because it was partly like a accessibility thing. It was just easier to buy cotton bias binding than make it. I know it's probably not entirely historically accurate. Would they have used cotton bias binding? Would they have cut binding on the bias? I don't know. But I didn't really know what else to do. I did consider hemming it, but it was so fiddly. So that was one of the last things I did on this project, and I don't regret it. Like I say, as my health improved, I lost patience for the hand sewing. I just wanted a bit more instant gratification. So the cotton bias binding was able to deliver that for me. So here we are in my completed set of hand-sewn Regency underthings. I'm really pleased with the way this project has gone so far. It was exactly what I needed at the end of last year. It was just a no pressure, chilled thing to experiment with something new, because one of the things I hadn't really considered, and I don't think I've talked about much here, is that I've never actually made myself historical costumes before, and this is the very first one, and I think it's a great place to start. I know a lot of people start with the 18th century, but to be honest, I think Regency is simpler. We also need less fabric, so it's cheaper. So if you're starting out, I would definitely go for a Regency project. I can't wait to get cracking on the rest of it. I'm halfway through making a chemisette. Hang on, I will show you these. A sneak peek or what? So I have made the body of a chemisette. So this one is based on one of the Patterns of Fashion 1. It has a frilly collar and a ruffle. So I'm going to carry on working on the chemisette and then I'm going to start on the dress. So I think that's about it for this video. I'm really pleased with how this project's gone together so far. I did enjoy the historical construction, but I don't think I'll be doing any more of it. If you watched my Everything I Made in 2020 video, I talked a little bit about this towards the end. Something I learned about myself and how I like to sew in 2020 is that I'm not really bothered about the historical accurate construction. I am bothered about the historically accurate cut and textiles and things like that. But I'm a theatrical costume maker and I like doing what I do. I like doing my thing. So the dress that I'm making to go over all of this will be made with an overlocker and a sewing machine and all that good stuff. So those videos will be coming out at some point in the year. I'm not sure when. I'm hoping to make my more usual tutorial, sewing walkthrough videos that I make for those. So they take a bit longer, so I'm not sure when they'll be. So if you're interested in seeing those, make sure you subscribe because YouTube will then send you a notification when I put those out. Apart from that, I hope you enjoyed me blabbering on about my underwear for probably an hour. Thanks for watching. See you next time. After 2 months after I actually finished sewing, I'm finally getting around to sharing with you the making of my Relaxed Regency project. If you're new here and you have no idea what I'm on about, hello, thank you for joining us here on Retro Claude. I'm pretty sure I mention it in almost every video, but I'm disabled, and as a result my approach to sewing and costuming is a little bit different than a lot of the people we see here on YouTube or over on Instagram. Firstly, until I started on this Relaxed Regency project, I had never actually made myself a costume. I like to sew vintage clothes, but I haven't sewn anything earlier than the 1930s for myself. This is largely because I really didn't feel it was possible for me to wear historical clothing, due to the foundation garments just being so uncomfortable and cumbersome. But at the end of last year, I went through a really rough patch with my health and I had to put all other projects on hold while I was on very strict bed rest. I really missed sewing, however, and so I asked some of my fellow costumers for some ideas for an easy hand sewing project I could do from bed, and they suggested a Regency dress. Now, when I make historical clothes for others, I usually draft or drape a pattern from scratch, but that wasn't an option from bed, so I had to use a commercial paper pattern, and many people recommended Laughing Moon 138. And our little sew along was born. It's been so lovely to have all these people sewing along with this project, and I will put a link to the Relaxed Regency playlist in the cards. We're almost at 40 videos now, which is so exciting. I never believed so many people would join in with this sew along. It's been so great to watch everybody's Regency outfits coming together. I've already made a video about the undergarments, which I will also link to. These were all made when I was in bed, but at the beginning of the new year, my health started to pick up, and I wanted to throw myself into this project a bit more, in the hopes I could enter the Foundations Revealed competition. As a result, this went from being a relaxed Regency project to a stressed Regency project. I occasionally do this to myself. Whenever I have to take time off and prioritize my health, I end up feeling really guilty and then overwork myself because I feel I have to catch up or to prove to myself that I'm better or whatever. The psychology of being disabled is tough, man. But anyway, I threw together this project in about a month and I made the deadline for the competition. I did film a lot of the process, but as I've been working my way through editing these videos, oh man, it's so chaotic, and I can't really make sense of a lot of it, so I've done my best to edit together some videos that will at least give you an idea of how these garments were made. But there will be sections where I just have to talk you through what I did. I've tried to divide the footage up by garment, so this video is about the chemisette, which is the white frilly collar attached to almost like a little undershirt or partlet. So for the pattern, I turned to Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 1. There's a whole page of chemisettes, and I chose the one that was closest to the time period I was working in. Oh, I should say the Foundations Revealed competition has a theme, and this year the theme was Once Upon a Time, so you had to make a costume for a character from a book. As I was already making a Regency dress, I decided to sort of adapt the costume to fit the theme, and so this became a costume for Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Little Dorrit is set in the late 1820s, so that was the era we're going for here. I scaled up the pattern and checked it was going to fit me, labeling it carefully so I knew what it was. I am very suspicious of Janet Arnold patterns generally. I know people rave about them, but they are really hit and miss. Janet Arnold was a historian, not a pattern cutter, and there are times when it shows, so I only ever use her patterns as a guide for shapes and seam placement. We also had a big discussion among costumers about the fabric names for different weights of cotton. Now, they vary from country to country, but this is what I consider a muslin, or at least as close to a muslin as we can get in the modern era. Janet Arnold described the original chemisette as being made of cambric, which, unless cambric meant something different in the 70s, it is quite clear to see from the photograph of this chemisette on the National Trust online collection, it is not. Cambric is not sheer and is also known as chambray, and so I used my eyes and academic discretion and went with muslin. All the edges of the chemisette body were finished with the tiniest rolled hem I could manage. In a way, I wish I had made it just a touch bigger, because this doesn't feel very secure from fraying. The shoulder seams were joined with a mantua maker's seam. If you don't know what this is, I recommend watching the video that Burnley and Trowbridge has on this technique. At this point, I was still hand sewing everything, mostly because this muslin was very delicate and the machine stitching would have been too imposing and distorting. I drew threads to cut the muslin as straight as I could for the gathered frill that goes around the edge of the collar. The frill was longer than the width of the fabric, so I had to seam some pieces together, again by hand. I measured out the width of the frill as described in Patterns of Fashion and cut the frill edge with pinking shears. The original was described as having the edge buttonhole stitched over. I did a sample of this and it looked awful and just pulled out the threads of the muslin, so I opted for a modern solution. Fray check. I knew that I wanted the colour of the chemisette to be hand embroidered because I'm not brilliant at embroidery and I wanted to get better. I also wanted this to be an opportunity to incorporate some little Dorrit-ness into this costume. So I played around and I came up with a design that is based on some original Regency embroidery patterns, but is adapted to represent some of the themes of Little Dorrit. In case you're not familiar with the plot of Little Dorrit, Amy, or Little Dorrit, is born in debtor's prison. Her father was a gentleman who fell in hard times and ended up in debtor's prison. The family's fortunes then change for the better, and Amy struggles to adjust to this newfound life of wealth. So I chose symbols of wealth and imprisonment for the embroidery. These scrolls are actually pound signs, we've got some Victorian style handcuffs, and these are locks, and then the scallops around the edge are to represent the ups and downs of the Dorrit family's fortunes. These I chose to work in chain stitch. I find chain stitch to be one of the simplest embroidery stitches and it looks very effective. Indian styles of embroidery like Ari and Tambour were very popular in the Regency era because of colonialism. So you see lots of examples of it both in its traditional form and in imitation. The pound signs were worked in backstitch and the other elements in satin stitch. The chains of the handcuffs were made using French knots. I used whip gathers to both finish the edge of the frill and gather it down. Again, Burnley and Trowbridge have a video on this if you want to see it in more detail. I realised that I needed to consider how much I needed to gather it up to fit around the collar. So I did some measuring and marked on the midpoints on both the collar and the frill. That way I could make sure to gather the frill down to the right amount as I was sewing. I then whipped the edge of my whip gathered frill onto the roll hemmed edge of my collar. It was then time to attach the collar to the body of the chemisette. I wasn't entirely sure how to do this and I was short on seam allowance and things were starting to fray pretty badly. In the end, I decided on a mantua maker's seam like for the shoulders. I pinned the collar on in readiness, but I had this weird extension past the edge of the collar. This is what I mean about Janet Arnold patterns. No information was given about where the edge of the collar should come to and the illustration wasn't very helpful. Thankfully, for this particular pattern, I could look at the photo of the original object. It turns out not all the edges had a rolled hem. There was actually quite a substantial turn back on the centre front edge, and the edge of the frill looked like it was sewn to the neckline too. Unfortunately, it was too late for me to do this as I had already stitched the frill on back from the very edge of the collar. It ended up turning back like a little revere, which is kind of cute, but not how it was supposed to look. And you might be able to see in this clip that I actually stitched the collar onto the body of the chemisette wrong, so the seam allowances and hems of the body are on the outside. This is really annoying, but I can't fix it because the fabric is too delicate. I would ruin the collar completely if I took it off, so I'm going to have to live with it. But all in all, it turned out just how I wanted it. It's subtle, has that neoclassical feel, but on closer inspection you start to see the symbolism of Little Dorrit. We all make stupid mistakes at times, and that's okay. This was such a simple little project. It's only the embroidery that took forever. I certainly will not be retraining as an embroiderer anytime soon. It does not bring me the same kind of joy that garment making does. Indeed, hand sewing in general is not my cup of tea. I mentioned this in my undergarments video, but I am perfectly happy to use a sewing machine for construction seams. I am sure our ancestors will be like, yo, what are you doing? What a privilege to have so much free time that you choose not to use this incredible labor-saving device you have at your disposal. And you know, I as a disabled person have to be mindful of how I spend my mental and physical energy, and hand sewing is just not something I want to do with my time. That being said, I am glad I took the time to do it on this project. It's always good to keep trying new skills so that you stay sharp. There are some other projects I want to do that involve embroidery, and so I feel a lot more confident about doing them now that I've done this chemisette. So that's all for now. There will be more videos coming about the rest of this project, both how I made the Laughing Moon 138 pattern and also how I made my straw bonnet, which I hope will be useful for you. So really, all that's left to say is, thanks very much for watching. See you next time. I blow dried my hair this morning because it's getting so long, and the resulting look is kind of like that bitch in a 90s teen movie that I secretly always hoped I would grow up to become. Oh, wait, hang on. Much better. I really hope you appreciate that joke because I had to go all the way up the stairs to get this thing. Hello and welcome back to this Relaxed Regency series where I take you through the making of my 1820s Little Dorrit project using Laughing Moon pattern 138. I have lots of other videos about this project, so I shall provide you with links to those if you should like to start this little series from the beginning, because this video is about the making of the dress itself, or rather, it's about the making of the dress bodice. At the time, I hadn't really realised it, but the making of this project was mammoth. And as a result, the construction of this dress is much too long to fit into one video. So I've split it up into more manageable chunks. This whole project started as a sew-along to help me through a difficult time with my health. So there is also a playlist of wonderful videos that other people have made about this pattern and other Regency garments that I shall link you to. But first of all, we need to talk about this bodice. Now, the bodice for Laughing Moon 138 is very straightforward. In fact, you might call it basic. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's historically accurate and leaves you a lot of room to play with trim and decoration. But as I had made the decision to enter this dress into a competition, I knew I needed a little more construction complexity than just 2 darts. I was constructing this like I would a costume for a film, and one of the things about film costumes is you get a lot of waist-up close-ups, so this should be where the focus of the decoration should be. And as a lot of decoration in the Regency era is self-fabric, which sometimes can get lost on camera, I decided to go for a textured approach. I traced off the pattern and then manipulated that one big dart into what I hoped would be a sunray-shaped row of tucks. I pinned the pattern piece into shape on the dress form and noticed I had this excess volume at the armhole, so I decided I would need to toile this new design. I really loved the way these tucks looked when pinned in, but when I made up the toile, I really wasn't happy with it and went with something else, as I shall now explain in this very foggy and incoherent vlog footage. So I've been beavering away today and I've had my Christmas tunes on my phone, and I film on my phone. So I completely forgot to film anything today. I was just rocking out to the Christmas music. So I thought it's coming towards the end of the day now, so I thought I'd do a little summary of what I've been up to today, because I've made quite good progress. My mock-up now has a sleeve. I'm not thrilled with the volume of the sleeve. Really, I'd like more, I think, but that depends on how much fabric I have, and as I need a lot of the fabric for piping and decoration, I'm going to try and just live with it, I think, because I'm going to have the long undersleeve as well, the Marie sleeve. Hopefully that will give it a bit more impact in this area. But yeah, I changed the bodice. So this bodice is based on one in Janet Arnold. This one. Because my previous bodice I thought was too subtle, particularly, so the fabric that I'm using for this project is cotton sateen, and it's quite heavyweight, and I don't think that delicate little tucks is really going to work with that. So I've gone for this more defined, exaggerated, so these are cartridge pleats and these are gathers at the top, and I've altered it ever so slightly because it's a bit pouchy for the final, but with the weight of the skirt that should sit quite nicely over the bosom. I've also been working on, this is going to be a detachable pelerine, so I've got this. So my bodice, I've put in this yoke, and I've seen this on quite a few extant examples actually from later in the 1820s. So this neckline's going to be piped, and this seam's going to be piped, the armholes are going to be piped, everything's going to be piped. And so my plan is that with the double layer sleeves as well, I'm going to have two outfits in one, so I can take the pelerine off and the undersleeves and have a short sleeve evening dress, and with that I can tack the undersleeves back in and I can put the pelerine on, and we've got a walking dress, a day dress. What else have I worked on today? Oh yeah, so patterning the pelerine took quite a lot of work because I wanted to make sure I got the proportion right with the ruffle, and I'm going to have a little chemisette collar as well, which I also cut out today. So yeah, the collar of the chemisette will be sheer over the purple, and that will also have a ruffle which will hopefully sit inside this ruffle, so it's going to be really ruffly. That's about all the progress I've made today. I mean, that makes it sound like I haven't achieved a lot, but I've re-patterned the front. I made my second front bodice mock-up. The back I'm keeping the same. I re-patterned it, tweaked the pattern again, patterned the pelerine. I cut the sleeve from this calico because this is I'm going to use this, I'm going to starch this and use that as an interlining for the sleeves to get more volume. So I've made quite good progress. Ooh. I'm doing these Marie sleeves. So the sleeves will have the bands, and then they're going to have rouleau trim at the cuff, just bands of it. And then the skirt hem is going to have these big rouleau, this type of rouleau, you know, padded rouleau. This shape. Scallops. Because this is now a Little Dorrit costume, I wanted to incorporate some more like, do I mean semantics? I don't know what I mean. Some like design choices, you know. This dress, like this costume, is kind of from a moment in the story of Little Dorrit, where they've gone out of debtor's prison. They've gotten out of debtor's prison, and the Dorrit family living the high life. They're really enjoying their wealth, trying to fit into society. And Little Dorrit, the young Amy Dorrit, is really struggling with that, you know, and she keeps getting told off by her family for acting like a servant, and, you know, she can't get used to having people wait on her hand and foot, and you know, not talking to her old friends and things like that. So even though she's now free from the prison, this new life is just as confining for her, so I wanted to represent that as well in this costume. Despite all the wealth and finery, she's still not free from the shadow of the debtor's prison. So I'm including these little allegorical details. I think that was the word I was looking for earlier. I'm excited to cut the fabric and really get started because the trimming is going to take an age. So once I've actually got a dress ready and made up, I'll feel like I've, made good progress. I'm hoping to have it made up by the end of the year, and then January can be decoration, embroidering my chemisette, and making a bonnet, which I'm excited about. So, von Weihnachten, I guess. With my pattern pieces finalised, I started cutting them out in batches. I actually cut the big skirt panels first, but more of that another time, so I used the offcuts to cut the yoke pieces. Then in my next batch, I cut the rest of the pattern pieces, including all of the decorative cuffs and the sleeves. I really love this moment when you get the effect of the negative space like this after cutting. Oh, so pretty. Anyway, I transferred all the markings to the newly cut out pattern pieces using carbon paper and a tracing wheel, and then took apart my mock-up to use as flat lining. I simply overlocked the two layers together. The next thing to cut was all the bias strips I would need to make the piping. I just chalked these on using a set square and then cut them with scissors. I actually did a lot of maths to figure out exactly how much piping I would need for each seam, so I had an approximate idea of how many bias strips to cut. To make up the piping, rather than join all those strips together and then make one giant length of continuous piping, I measured each seam that needed piping and then cut the cord to the right length. I then matched each length of cord with a bias strip that was approximately the right length. Sometimes I could get 2 lengths of piping out of one bias strip. In the end, I only ended up with 1 seam in the piping, which I strategically chose for the bottom of the belt as I thought that was the least obvious place for it. So then I had to make up all those little bits of piping. This I did with my zipper foot and just rolling one edge over. I didn't sandwich the piping in the middle, I offset the seam allowances slightly to save on fabric, and so I didn't have to cut one edge down later to reduce bulk. I then pinned those lengths of piping to the sewing lines of their corresponding seams and then carefully machined them on again with the zipper foot. With the piping machined on, I could begin pinning everything together. Whoa, geez, that's bright. Okay, here, we skipped a bit because the footage was hurting my eyes. I then machined the panels together, also using the zipper foot. What you can't see here, because my hand is in the way, is that I am carefully stitching just to the left of the line of stitching for the piping, so that the machine sewing for the piping won't be seen on the outside of the garment. I then pressed that curved seam over a tailor's ham. The next step was to construct the bodice front. I began by marking on the cartridge pleat placement every ½ centimetre. I used 2 lines of gathering stitches for the cartridge pleating, so marked on a second line. Using a heavy buttonhole thread for strength, I stitched a running stitch along the pleating line, weaving the needle in and out of those ½ centimetre chalk marks I had just made. I then repeated this for the second row of gathering stitches. For the top edge of the bodice, I used machine gathering, turning up the stitch length and turning down the tension and sewing 2 rows of stitches next to each other. I'm using the zipper foot here just because I couldn't be bothered to change back to my ordinary presser foot. I then pulled up those gathers to the correct length and gave them a good stroke with a pin to make them lie nice and flat and even. Then, using my zipper foot again and holding the bottom edge of the white flat lining out of the way, I machined the yoke to the bodice front, carefully stitching over the gathered sections. I then did the rest of the bodice construction. The shoulder seams, again stitching just outside the stitching line for the piping, and the side seams, which weren't piped. I pressed all those seams open, then I turned under the edge of the flat lining to hide the raw edges of the yoke join before pressing and pinning it in place. Then I felled down the fold with a double thread for strength. I could have slip stitched it, but I thought the fell looked more historically accurate and would probably be firmer. I machined on the piping, carefully easing around the curves of the armhole. This was quite bulky, particularly over the seams that had already been piped, so I went very slowly. Oh wait, was that last bit the neckline and this is the armhole? I can't tell, but either way, I repeated the process to also finish the neckline. For one of the armholes, my piping ended up being too short. I'm not sure how that happened, seeing as I did all that careful measuring, but boy was that annoying. But I will let past Claude express that frustration. So it turns out the piping I made for one armhole fits, but it's just, and I mean just by millimeters too short for the other armhole. So I've got this bit of piping which is no good to me. And unfortunately, this is all the piping cord I have left. It means I'm going to have to buy more piping cord and make more piping before I can finish the armholes and get on with the sleeves. So obviously we're in lockdown still in the UK, which means I'm going to have to order it online. So it's going to take days, possibly a week to arrive. Oh God. And that's the thing really with a bodice, when you get to the point where you're about to put in the sleeves, there's not much else you can do. But I was able to get one armhole piped and the neckline, so I've got to snip these and press them round and all of that and catch stitch them down. It's just really frustrating because I mean I've got a lot of work to do on the sleeves. I've got to make and trim the sleeves, and I've got to trim the skirt, so there's definitely things I can do whilst I'm waiting for my piping to arrive. It's just so annoying. So annoying. Why this much? I was this close. Oh God. While I waited for the piping to arrive, I finished the centre back edge of the bodice, turning back the seam allowance and herringboning the facing in place. I also marked and chalked on the centre back line for the placement of the fastenings, but I didn't sew those on until after I had joined the bodice to the skirt. Even with me making the bodice construction 10 times more complicated than it needed to be, this was a really simple bodice to construct. You've got those curved back seams, which can be tricky, and all that piping of course complicates things further. But in fact, the bodice of this pattern is really quite straightforward. That being said, remember, I am a trained costume maker, so I basically didn't look at the instructions at all. But the few times I did, they did seem thorough and easy to understand. In terms of fit, I found the fit to be pretty good. You may remember from the undergarments video that I had to make the front panel pieces several sizes smaller than the back pattern pieces. But I highly suspect that's more to do with my body and not a reflection on the way this pattern actually fits. So I think this is a good place to leave this project for this video. The next video will take you through the trials and tribulations I had with the not one, but 2 sets of sleeves I had for this outfit. And then there will be subsequent videos covering the making and the trimming of the skirt, and also the making of the bonnet. So all that's left to say is, thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to the next instalment in this little series where I take you through the making of my 1820s Little Dorrit costume. If you've been following along with this project, you will know that we are now up to the sleeves. If you have no idea what I'm on about, I recommend that you pause this video and actually go and watch the rest of the series first, because otherwise this is going to be a little bit random, because this video is just about sleeves. Now there are 2 sets of sleeves for this 1820s Little Dorrit project, a puff short sleeve and then a long undersleeve in that sort of Marie style with the ruching. And it was a lot of work and it didn't necessarily all go to plan. You may remember from the end of the last video that I had actually run out of piping cord, and so I couldn't quite finish off the bodice. So I had to sort of pause the bodice, and I decided that there was lots of prep work I could do on the sleeves, and that's where we begin this video. While I waited for more piping to arrive, I could turn my attention to all the cuffs and bands I had needed to make for the sleeves, as I'd already made up the piping for those before I ran out of piping for my armhole. Some of the bands needed to be attached to the sleeves flat, so I decided to pipe them all flat before sewing the cuffs up into a loop. This turned out to be a mistake. For the long sleeve cuffs, I realised that I needed to sew the cuff into a loop before I applied the piping. The wrist cuff was really small and had to function like a proper cuff, only with piping in the seams, so that was why I decided to not pipe it flat like I had the applied decorative bands. I'm not sure why I thought the short sleeve cuffs would work flat when the long sleeve cuffs wouldn't, seeing as the short sleeve cuffs are exactly the same as the long sleeve cuffs, only fractionally wider, but more on that later. In the meantime, I pressed that long sleeve cuff seam open before chalking on the line for the piping. I pinned the piping in place, making sure to match the sewing line of the piping to the chalked on sewing line for the cuff. When I got back around to the beginning, I overlapped the edge of the piping, pivoting them up and into the seam allowance so that there wouldn't be a raw piping edge visible on the outside. I checked to make sure that doing this hadn't caused the piping to shift off the sewing line at either side of the seam. Getting this diddy cuff under the sewing machine was a huge challenge. I have really tiny wrists and I knew I needed these cuffs to be tight, but I didn't want to put an opening in them, so they still had to be big enough to get my hand through. But even with that, the cuffs were still only 19 centimeters and it was very fiddly. I sewed the 2 layers of the decorative bands right side together and then began turning them right side out. Now that I watch it back, I realise that at this point I had made a huge mistake in the way I was approaching the construction of those armbands. I tried to bag them out, which turned out to be a really stupid decision, because with the bulk of the piping they were almost impossible to turn, and when I did get them the right way out, they were all distorted and the edges had frayed so much that I couldn't use them at all. If you do a lot of sewing, and a lot of sewing as in a lot of frequent sewing, you know, all day, every day, for weeks at a time, you will know that there are sometimes just days where everything you touch goes wrong, and I don't know what it is, I don't know why that happens, but today has been one of those days for me, and everything has just gone wrong, and I'm just done with it, to be honest. It's making me hate this project. It's now not going to be done in time for the Foundations Revealed competition, so I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? You know, I've just completely lost motivation and everything I touch has gone wrong. So I started the day, you can't see it, hang on. I started the day by sewing the collar onto my chemisette, but I don't know if you can see that. That's the seam allowances poking up because I accidentally stitched, instead of wrong side to right side like you do when you do a collar, I put right sides together instinctively. And I've done tiny little, just absolutely minuscule mantua maker's hem. It's a really beautiful seam, mantua maker's seam even. Really tiny, close, you know, 18th century hand stitches or whatever, 19th century, you know what I mean. And it's bloody inside out, and I don't have it's not even so much the energy, it's just the will. I just really do not want to unpick it. And so I decided to move on to finishing off the trimmings for the sleeves, and I was making up, these were to be the sleeve bands that gather in the long sleeves, but I tried to turn them, like I shouldn't have done it, I knew that it wasn't going to work really, but so I sewed them right sides together like this and then was going to try and turn them inside out, which was a right pain, but I thought I did it, but when it came out it's completely warped it, because this is a stretch sateen, it's got elastane in, and so it's completely warped, and the where I had to grade the seam allowance down so much, it's frayed out as well, so that'll have to go in the bin. Bless her, my mum's made me a cup of tea to try and cheer me up, and it says I'd rather be in my garden. I'm feeling it right now, I'm feeling it. And so I really don't know what to do at this point. I'm really tempted to completely stop this and do something else really simple. I've got a 1970s pinafore dress that I want to make, having seen Gwen's shenanigans video. So I might just sod it. I might just abandon it, resign it to the UFO pile for now, and come back to it at a later date. This was supposed to be a relaxing project, and I tried to make it into a Foundations Revealed competition entry, and it's turned out really stressful. And I don't know why I've done this to myself. So I'm thinking I might just take away all that stress, chill out a bit, and come back to this later. Who knows? I'm definitely doing no more sewing today because anything I touch is going to go wrong, I guarantee it. So today I've been taking it a bit easy. Well, I haven't been filming today because after the stress of everything going wrong yesterday, I just really didn't want to have the pressure of filming myself rectifying all the mistakes I've made. I don't know, my self-esteem had taken a bit of a hit and I was like, I just need to sort this out, pull myself together and get on with it. So one of the things that helped is that my second batch of piping cord has arrived, so I was able to finish some piping that I'd had to abandon. So now I have got my armholes piped and I've got my neckline piped, and I've also herringboned down, or catch stitched as it's known in the US, and flannel stitch it's also known as. So I've herringboned the binding around the neckline down, so I've got a lovely finished neck edge now. And I've clipped my armholes. I clipped them a bit early. I've still got to attach the sleeves, obviously. I kind of forgot about that step, but oh well. So the armholes are piped. Both armholes are piped now, which is one of the things I had to abandon. What else went hideously wrong? So I originally piped my cuffs in a straight line and then was going to seam them together. And then I decided that that was really bulky and a stupid thing to do. So I've actually remade all my cuffs so that they were made up as a circle, and then I added the piping. So these for the wrists, they're very snug, but thankfully this is a stretch sateen, so I should still be able to get them on. And they're very narrow, so I've had to do a lot of seam allowance grading, which I don't usually do because it makes things less alterable. But this is going to be a very narrow cuff. Can you see that? Which is okay, because I've seen some fashion plates with very narrow cuffs, but I was expecting, on my half scale, I don't know if you can see, this is the police robe pattern from Janet Arnold, 1824 to 27, and I was expecting to have these sort of wide cuffs that, if I put her arms up it doesn't work, they fit low over the hand like that. So that's what I was expecting from this Laughing Moon pattern. Turns out I'm not getting that, I'm getting these dinky little things instead. Which is fine. I'm okay with that. So yes, so I've got, these are for the long undersleeves, and then these are fractionally wider. These are for the short oversleeves. And then, as you might have seen, I've still got it here actually, I had an absolute disaster trying to turn through these armbands. These are together in the long sleeve below the end of the short sleeve, and I'd originally tried to bang them out and it didn't work. So I've recut these, remade these, I had to make more piping, and unfortunately that means I've now got a seam in my bias somewhere there. But you can't really tell, can you? And they're a little bit wobbly, a little bit uneven, but I'm kind of okay with that. I don't think that's really gonna notice. Yeah, I think it should be fine. So with these complete, what I ended up doing for these instead was making them essentially like a waistband, sewing two edges, flipping one, pressing it under, and then slip stitching it. You can probably just see the little puckers, yeah, to see where I've hand stitched it. Oh, which, I mean, it's gonna have to be slip stitched onto the sleeve itself anyway, so I'm not that worried about that, but yeah, it feels really good to have all these bits for the sleeves done. And now I can start on constructing the sleeves, and I actually feel like I'll be making progress rather than just in this weird piping hell. Being so behind, like where's my original timescale? Hang on. The only thing I haven't fixed is the fact that I sewed the collar onto the chemisette wrong. And I've decided that I'm just going to leave it because actually the fabric is so delicate. I don't have a lot of seam allowance, I had to trim it all away. And if I unpick it, it's probably going to completely unravel and I'll have a mess. So I'm just going to have to live with the fact that the body of the chemise is inside out. Oh well, but what was I saying? Yes, so today is the 12th. And according to my original time scale, I should have attached the rouleau trim to the skirt today, having completely finished the bodice and the sleeves. So obviously we're not there. But I have made a new time scale, and I do think I still might just be able to finish in time for the Foundations Revealed competition, but I don't know whether I'll have time to make a bonnet, which is annoying because I've bought all the materials for a bonnet, But I mean, this outfit will need a bonnet, so it's not the end of the world, but just wanted a bonnet, you know, I wanted the whole ensemble, proper costume. But anyway, so the last thing I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm going to make up the short sleeves and attach the bands, and so that they're made up and ready to fit into the bodice tomorrow. I doubt I'll get in the short sleeves today, because sleeves are pretty time consuming and I don't really want to start doing those. It's 4 o'clock now, which if you've watched a lot of my videos you will know tends to be my lowest ebb in the day in terms of fatigue, so I don't like to start anything tricky at this moment in the afternoon, which is frustrating because it normally means I normally work till about 6, so yeah, normally it means that like quite often I've got 2 hours at the end of the day where I can't really start anything. I don't really know what to do with myself. But yeah, I think I can make up the sleeves ready, sew in the gathering stitches, things like that. All right, so I'm going to crack on with that now. So I'll be, I haven't filmed, so that was why I haven't filmed this, but I imagine I will take you through the next part of this process now that I'm back on the right track. I might go and make myself a cup of tea first though. Cup of tea made, I stitched 2 rows of machine gathering stitches around the sleeve heads of both the long and short sleeves and along the bottom edges for the cuffs. Amazingly, my bobbin ran out at the best possible time, having already stitched 1 line of gathering, so I rewound the bobbin before I carried on with the gathering stitches. I joined the seams in the short sleeves matching all the markings, then pressed those seams open. I pulled on the gathering threads to draw up the bottom of the sleeve to fit the cuff, but the fabric was so thick that I couldn't get the sleeve to gather nicely and the threads snapped. So I resorted to a different gathering method, zigzagging over a length of button thread to create a sort of channel, then pulling on that button thread to gather the sleeve down. This was much more successful. I decided to concentrate the gathers towards the middle of the sleeve instead of have them evenly spaced for a bit more visual impact. To check I was happy with the way it looked, I pinned the sleeve into the bodice and tried it on the mannequin. Only it was hard to tell what the sleeve would look like without an arm in it, so I tried it on myself. But I got on the wrong side of the pins. I added the pattern piece for the pelerine to see how I felt about the proportions, and was starting to feel that this project might actually turn out how I had envisioned it. I repeated the making process for the other cuff, gathering the sleeve down to fit the cuff, and then tacking and sewing it in place. I graded out as much of the flat lining as I could to reduce the bulk. This was tricky where I'd already gathered the fabric down. I also graded the seam allowance of the sleeve and of the piping so I could cleanly roll the cuff around to the inside along the seam line and press it into place. More seam allowance grading, this time for the raw edge of the cuff that was to be turned under on the inside. Once clipped, I turned that raw edge under to meet the stitching line and pressed it in place. With waxed double thread, I then slip stitched the turned under edge of the cuff in place on the wrong side. I was very careful to only catch the flat lining layer of the sleeves so that the stitches wouldn't show on the right side. I pinned and then tacked those short sleeves into the bodice. I had to redo the gathering threads for the sleeve heads as well, zigzagging over a button thread to gather it down to fit the armhole. I then carefully machined the sleeves in using my zipper foot to get as close as possible to the piping around the armhole as I could. I usually machine my sleeves in 2 halves, but I couldn't do that on this project as I needed to be able to see the stitching line for the piping, so I went very carefully and slowly to avoid puckers and tucks. Of course, I had to redo the piping on the armhole that was too short before I could sew in the second sleeve. With the short sleeves sewn in, I knew I wanted to make the long undersleeves detachable, and that meant I would need some way to attach them to the bodice. The method I settled on I actually learnt from Nikki Liam's channel. She made interchangeable sleeves for her 1830s dress and added an armhole facing to be able to sew them in more easily. I traced the shape of the armhole to create my facing pattern and then made it, I think, 5 centimeters wide all the way around. I then cut the facing piece from both the white cotton flat lining and a scrap of purple sateen. I tacked the 2 layers together with long diagonal basting stitches before flatlining them together on the overlocker. Next, I joined the underarm seams and pressed them open, and the facings were ready to go. Now I had to turn my attention to the long undersleeves themselves. I stitched 2 lines of gathering stitches at the sleeve hem to gather them into the cuff. But for the sleeve head, I used the same technique as before, zigzagging over a length of buttonhole thread. I was drastically running out of thread at this point, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I ran out completely. I tacked the sleeve underarm seams together by hand to save on thread, and then quickly pinned them into the armhole so that I could decide on the placement of the bands. I put the bodice on the stand to do this, but it turned out I needed an arm inside the sleeve to get the right blousing effect. So I put the bodice on myself and then struggled and faffed about trying to get these sleeve bands and rouleau trim in the right place. The rouleau trim is just a bias strip folded in half lengthways and then turned right side out. You can also hand sew them from the right side, but I machined mine for speed. Positioning the trim was particularly difficult at the cuffs, but I did manage to get something like the effect I wanted. I then took the sleeve off and trued up all those lines, marking them in with tailor's chalk. I was actually surprised at how straight I'd been able to pin these things. Making clothes for yourself is really hard at times. Having decided on the placement, I stitched in 2 lines of gathering stitches at each point where the sleeve was to be gathered down. I then gathered the sleeves down to the required length for each piece of rouleau trim and slip stitched the rouleau in place, hiding the gathering stitches. When finished, the sleeve cuffs looked like this. The rouleau turned out quite wrinkly. The stretch of the sateen on the bias made it pucker quite a lot, but I made my peace with it. Before I could attach the sleeve bands, I needed to finish the raw edges. I could have gotten my overlocker out for this, or zigzagged it on the machine, but the overlocker is heavy and I didn't have the strength to get it out, and I was so low on thread, I decided to just oversew the end by hand instead. I gathered up the sleeve where the armband was going to be attached, and then adjusted the gathers to fit the length of the band by pinning it in place at both ends and then stretching out the gathers to fit. Of course, they didn't stretch out evenly, so I spent some time redistributing the volume of the gathers before pinning the band in place over the top of the gathering stitches. I then slip stitched the band in place along both edges. Here I'm doing an even slip stitch, so I'm basically just weaving the needle in and out of the 2 layers I'm attaching before pulling the thread through. And of course, repeat for the other side of the band and the other sleeve. I did all this work while the sleeve was flat, as I knew it would be much easier, so now I had to join the sleeve underarm seam, carefully making sure that the applied decoration matched up. Only you can see that even my really quite heavy-duty Bernina sewing machine was struggling to get over these really bulky sections with the double layer of trim. So I got out this little plastic thingy that I only know colloquially as a hump jumper. Basically, you sew to the point where the fabric is too bulky for your machine to cope, leave the needle down but lift the presser foot, and slide the hump jumper in behind the needle and then drop the foot down onto this little bit of plastic, and it means you can sew over these bulky little things. So once again, if you missed it, this time with the sleeve band. Needle down, presser foot up. This band was particularly chunky, so I struggled to get the hump jumper underneath the presser foot behind the needle. Presser foot back down again, and away we go, sewing over this super thick section of the sleeve. Do you know, I'm starting to despair a little bit with this project. this is all the thread I have left, all of it. Because I did so much unpicking, there's a lot of gathering on this, so I had to do, loads of gathering stitches, and had to redo my gathering because it didn't work because the fabric was too heavy, so I had to just pull a whole load of gathering stitches out. Yeah, so I've gone through 250 meters of thread already. And obviously this is a really specific shade of purple. It's also the natural cotton as opposed to the sew-all thread. For historical accuracy or whatever reason I chose this. I think I chose this because the colour was a better match actually, to be honest. But yeah, with it being such a specialist and unique type of thread, it's really difficult to get hold of. So I have finally been able to track down 100 metre reels of this thread colour from Gutermann. And of course it's locked down, so I have to wait for it to arrive and the postage is delayed. So I've done everything I can. I had a bobbin full of thread left, well, like half a bobbin worth of thread left, and the top reel ran out, so I unwound some of it back onto the reel so that I could carry on sewing. And I've done mostly hand sewing today, but this is really like half a metre of thread left probably. So I really can't do any more on this project. Well, I can't do any more sewing at least. There's some cutting things. I have to cut all the bias trim for the decoration, of course, which now I'm looking at however much yardage I've got left. I really hope it's enough, because knowing me in this project, it's probably not enough. So I might go and check if they've still got this fabric in stock at Minerva. So I can do that, but it's the 15th today, which means it's just under 3 weeks. I'm looking at my calendar up here. It's just under 3 weeks to the Foundations Revealed competition deadline. It's getting really tight. I don't know if I'm going to make it. Bearing in mind I also have to do do a photo shoot, and that is dependent on energy and mobility. So, just if I push through to meet this deadline, the likelihood of me being able to get dressed up and go and take some nice photos of it is quite slim, because I'll be so exhausted from panic sewing. So I'm in a really tricky place. So I really don't know what to do. My millinery supplies have arrived to make a bonnet, so I might divert my attentions now to the bonnet. My thread, I was able to find a thread with a first class delivery option. So let's see when that gets here. It said it was dispatched today, but it's the weekend, so beginning of next week, probably earliest, the 19th, maybe, it's 18th, 19th is what we're looking at probably for my thread arrival. So I've got a weekend, can plan and cut my trim. I can also start work on this bonnet. Yeah, I'll just have to wait and see when the thread gets here, really. On the plus side, it is looking really cute. I'm really pleased with it so far. I might put what I've done so far on the stands, that I can sort of look at it and feel a little bit of accomplishment. After all that, the thread actually arrived the next day, the 16th. Yes, I'm in my pyjamas in this clip. I was so excited, I just had to rip the parcel open as soon as possible. I tell you, I really needed this little win at this point in this project. It finally felt like things might be going my way. I could then get on with the final stages of making up these undersleeves. I pressed open the underarm seam, being careful not to press my rouleau in opposite directions. I then made the decision that these cuffs were just too small and fiddly to get under the machine, so I backstitched them on by hand. I then rolled them around to the wrong side, like I did for the short sleeves, and slip-stitched them in place on the inside. I could then attach the sleeves to the armhole facings I had made earlier. These would then be tacked in place with a few stitches at a later date, but I knew I wanted to wait to do this until after I had taken photographs of the short-sleeved version of the dress. So there we have it. The short sleeves are in and the long sleeves are ready to go when I need them. I can't lie, these sleeves were such a struggle. It wasn't even the sleeves themselves that was the issue, it was those bloody sleeve bands. The sleeves fit perfectly and were actually quite successful. It was just the decoration that made it so much more complicated. I mean, it was my own fault because I tried to bag those things out when I knew I shouldn't have, but still, it's annoying. Even though it was a struggle, I am really pleased with the way they look when made up. particularly the long sleeves. I love that I was able to include those little details to represent handcuffs, and from a practical point of view, I feel that having those two looks in one, the day and the evening bodice, I will potentially get more wear out of this outfit. The next part in this series will be the making of the skirt, but if you can't wait that long for your Regency fix, you can check out the Relaxed Regency playlist and take a look at all the other wonderful projects that people have been making as part of this sew along. With that, all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Welcome back to the next instalment of this Relaxed Regency project. I've had a little break from this series, so if you're in need of a refresher, I will leave a link to the playlist with the rest of the videos here. In the last video, we completed the bodice and the sleeves for the 1820s dress inspired by Little Dorrit, and we are now moving on to the making and decorating of the skirt. I began by laying out and cutting the pattern pieces for the skirt. The pattern I'm using here is Laughing Moon 138. I bought the PDF version of the pattern, but it only comes in A0 file sizes, so you'll need to have the pattern printed professionally. I'll be honest, since discovering that this is a service offered by a local craft store, I will probably never be taping A4 PDF pattern pieces together because it saves so much time and energy. Once everything was cut out, I began marking up the pattern pieces using a tracing wheel and carbon paper. Here I'm transferring the markings for the pleats at the centre back. Some of them were quite faint as the cotton sateen I was using for this project was quite thick, so I went over them with my chalk pencil. Next I overlocked all the raw edges. I was constructing this dress like I would a theatrical costume, while the accessories and underwear were mostly hand sewn. This was mostly to save time, but also so the dress is easier to alter should I need to in the future. I joined all the skirt panels together, leaving a gap for the centre back opening. I pressed the seams open and neatened the overlocking threads by threading them back on themselves. The next step was to work on the padded hem. I decided for this project it would be easier to shorten the skirt from the waist if I needed it, as there was going to be a lot of skirt decoration. It's much easier to decorate a skirt hem when it isn't attached to the bodice, but that means you can't check the final length, and if you get it wrong, you'll have to remove and respace all that skirt trim. It's much easier to set the hem, attach the trim, and then make any adjustments at the waist. I did a sample of this padded hem using a blind hem stitch on the sewing machine, and it worked brilliantly and was really quick. However, on the actual dress itself, it wasn't anywhere near as successful, and I ended up redoing the hem by hand later. But with the hem in place, I could start work on the padded rouleau trim. I cut wide strips of bias from my skirt fabric and strips of wadding to pad the hem. This is just some polyester wadding I had in stash. I believe historically they used wool roving, but the wadding worked just as well. I was a little puzzled how to sew the fabric around the wadding. Should I make a tube and feed the wadding through? But in the end, I just overlapped the raw edges of the bias strips and overcast them down. Being cut on the bias, the raw edges wouldn't fray, and this stitching wouldn't be seen, so I decided not to overcomplicate things. I did have to piece some of the bias pieces together to get strips of bias long enough to make the swag design I was going for. I began by roughly pinning out my padded rouleau into these scallop shapes. You may remember from my last video how I talked about including lots of scallop shapes in this design to represent the ups and downs of the Dorrit family's fortunes, and this shaping was based on a fashion plate from about this era, so I like that it's both period and character appropriate. I created these padded bows to cover up the top of the scallops. I just freehanded a pattern piece until I was happy with them, and then cut the shapes out of the fabric and wadding. I needed 2 layers of fabric and 1 of wadding for each bow. With right sides together, I joined 2 bow pieces together, leaving an opening to be able to turn it right side out. I then tacked the wadding piece in place on 1 layer, then trimmed and clipped my seam allowances to turn the whole thing inside out, sandwiching the wadding in the middle of the bow. I then gave them a gentle press and slip stitched the opening shut.
I did contemplate doing some sort of quilting design on these bows, but I actually liked how puffy and 3D they looked as it was, so decided against it. I then gathered the centre of each bow down and adjusted the volume so that the ends of each bow pointed downwards ever so slightly. A scrap of bias then got wrapped around the centre of each bow to hide the gathering stitches. This was just roughly stitched in place. Next, I returned to the padded rouleaus, finalising their placement and carefully measuring the spacing. I spent a long time carefully getting the lattice designs to be perfectly even. Next, I pinned the padded bows into position and trimmed off the excess rouleau. Then all of this got slip-stitched into position along both sides of the rouleau. It took forever, and I did most of it on the sofa in front of the telly, so I didn't film it. With all the decorations sewn on, it was time to pleat up the skirt ready to attach to the bodice. I carefully pinned the pleats in place following the chalk markings and then basted them. I then pinned and tacked the skirt to the bodice. I'm using a heavy duty thread here as the skirt is so heavy. I did a fitting at this point to check the length and it was actually just perfect, which was surprising seeing as I am only 163 centimeters tall. If you are blessed with height and you are making this pattern, you will probably have to make the skirt longer. I then machined the skirt in place. Pressed the seam open and herringboned the seam allowance of the bodice down to the bodice lining. Looking back on this, I'm not entirely sure why I did this. Maybe to reduce bulk at the waist or for a little extra support, I'm not sure. I could then begin adding the fastenings at the centre back. I used trouser hooks and bars for strength and ease of closure. At this point, the dress is technically finished, but I wanted to make the matching belt. I cut and pressed a layer of white cotton and purple sateen and stitched piping to the edges of the purple sateen piece. Then with right sides together and using my zipper foot, I stitched the white lining to the main purple along one edge, stitching as close to the piping as I could. I'd learnt my lesson about trying to bag out this fabric and piping combination, so I left one edge open so I could turn the belt right sides out more easily. I graded down the seam allowance and clipped the corners before pressing under the raw edge of the lining and slip stitching it in place. Then one last giant hook and bar for the belt closure was added and we're done! Only not quite. For the day walking dress look, I wanted to add a detachable pelerine. I drafted my own pattern for this and cut 2 layers of the sateen. I also cut a long strip to turn into a pleated ruffle. I had to join several strips together to get the ruffle to be long enough. I hemmed one edge using the blind hem stitch on my machine. I could have hand sewn it, but I needed the speed at this point as the Foundations Revealed competition deadline was fast approaching. I then pleated the ruffle down with box pleats to the correct length. I used the grids on my cutting mat as a rough guide to keep the pleats even, but I had to cheat a few to get things to match up. I tacked the pleats in place along the sewing line so that I could more easily attach the ruffle to the pelerine. I chalked on the sewing line for one half of the pelerine and then pinned the ruffle on with right sides together. I machined this one before adding the second layer of the pelerine. Oh, it looks like I tacked the ruffle on before sewing it. I'm very impressed. Good job, Past Claude. I then added the second layer of the pelerine, again right sides together, and machined through all the layers. I graded down all the seam allowances with pinking shears to help imitate the effect of clipping the curves. I then turned the pelerine right side out through an opening I had left at the centre back of the outside edge. Everything got a good press to make the edges lie smoothly. I then slip stitched the opening up and added a ribbon tie. Is that it? Are we done yet? Oh no, of course not. There's one very important detail left to finish. The butt bow. When I look back on this butt bow, it is a bit of a damp squib really. It needs to be bigger and perky, but it was such a last minute addition, I think I can forgive myself for that. It's just some tubes of leftover fabric sewn into loops and arranged to look like a bow. I just tacked it on at the end of the belt. And now, finally, the dress is complete. Of all the parts of this outfit, the skirt decoration is possibly the bit I am most proud of. It was fiddly and time-consuming, but so worth it. I really feel that it looks historically accurate. Of the two looks, I think I prefer the day look with the long sleeves and the pelerine. I don't know, I think the silhouette just looks more balanced with the wide ruffle of the pelerine. Let me know which you prefer. It's been quite a while since I finished this project, but I love it just as much as when I first finished it. There is one more video to come in this series, which is the making of the bonnet, but then we shall be leaving the Regency era for a little while. I have really enjoyed doing something more historical here on Retro Claude. So while I know many of you have subscribed for the mid-century vintage sewing content, I am hoping to do some more historical sewing projects too. Don't worry, I'm still going to be doing plenty of vintage sewing and knitting, but it is nice for me to take on these bigger, more challenging costume projects. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to make them into little series, so there will be regularly scheduled vintage content, and then every once in a while we'll have a historical series like this one. So let me know what you think. Are there any historical eras I should try? Obviously, bear in mind that anything I make has to be compatible with mobility aids, so unfortunately panniers and farthingales are out of the question. And look out for the video about the bonnet, which should be coming your way soon. So all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to the final part in this Little Dorrit series where we are making a straw bonnet. It's been a long old haul with this project, and 6 months after finally finishing the outfit, we're getting to the last of the videos. So thank you for sticking with this project for so long. If you'd like to catch up on the rest of the series, I will put a link to the playlist here for you, but if you're just interested in how to make a bonnet, I'll get into that now. So to make this straw bonnet, you're going to need to get your hands on some millinery straw braid. Now you can sometimes find this from specialist suppliers, but it's hard to come by and quite expensive, so it's often just easier to deconstruct a cheap straw hat. I actually bought these straw discs from Parkin Fabrics. They were very cheap and I ended up needing 2 of them to make this bonnet as it's pretty large. I didn't unravel the disc all the way. I left a circle with the diameter I needed the tip of my bonnet to be. I then began coiling the straw braid I had just unravelled around the edge of the circle, but instead of overlapping the layers to make a flat disc, I whipped the edge together at right angles to begin making the crown of the bonnet. I then kept on coiling the straw braid around, overlapping the previous row slightly and whipping the braid in place until my crown was the desired height. I was mostly doing this by eye and using a few fashion plates as reference. Once I had my bonnet crown, I drew around the bottom edge to begin making the pattern piece for the brim. Again, this I mostly did by eye using fashion plates for reference. I went bigger than my instincts were telling me because I tend to underestimate just how ridiculously big these things are. I then cut the pattern piece out and modelled it to determine if the size and shape were right or not. I felt it was a bit wide and needed a more graceful curve, so I played around until I was happy with the pattern shape. I then began pinning the straw braid into the shape of the pattern piece, starting in the middle and overlapping the previous row. When I got to the ends, I left a little excess but just folded the straw back on itself. I then zigzagged all that braid into place on the machine. This was tricky and awkward to get under the machine. I also kept catching my skin on the pins that were sticking up at various angles from the brim. But machining it was infinitely quicker than hand sewing it all, so it was worth it in the end. I didn't cut off the excess braid just yet, as I knew I wanted to use it to finish the edges of the bonnet. So once all of that was sewn into place, I drew in the curve from the pattern piece at the back of the bonnet where I'd done all that changing of direction, trimmed the excess off and then fitted the brim onto the crown of the bonnet to check it was the right size before machining the 2 edges of the brim together. I could then neaten that cut edge by machining the length of braid that I hadn't trimmed down earlier over the raw edges and the untidy section of the join. I also machined a layer of braid around the very outer edge of the brim so that it was a double thickness at this edge. This was sort of decorative, but also gave the outer edge some more stability. I folded under and neatened the raw edge and the brim was complete. All I had to do then was attach it to the crown. I pinned the crown into position and tried the bonnet on just to make sure I was happy with the shape. I love this bonnet so much, I'm so glad I took the time to make it. Then I hand-stitched the crown to the brim, first the lower edge from the inside and then the top edge from the outside. I used a strong linen thread, mostly because it was the best colour match I had for the straw, and a whip stitch to join the two layers together. With that, the structure of the bonnet was complete, and it was onto the decoration. I was heavily inspired by this fashion plate, which appeared to have this ruched fabric section on the bonnet. So I made a tube of fabric out of offcuts from the dress, pressed the seam open, and then turned the tube right side out. I played around with the ribbons to trim the hat with. I had wanted to include this yellow as a contrast pop of colour, but in the end I decided against it. Instead, I just used white 1-inch wide ribbon and threaded the ribbon through the fabric tube to ruche it up and then hand-stitched the ribbon in place. I also added ribbons to tie the bonnet in place, and then it was complete. I know you've seen the bonnet before in the reveal bits of all the other videos, but still, I love it so much I've included a few more close-ups for this video. This may be one of my favourite things I've ever made, and there's just something about a bonnet that makes you feel as cute as a button. I particularly like the way the light can shine through the lightweight straw, and that decoration is simple but still has impact. Oh, I'm so pleased with it. And we've made it to the end of Little Dorrit and Relaxed Regency. It's been such a pleasure to share all this with you, both my making process and the concept behind this collaboration. I hope this project has inspired you to sew at your own pace and to know that it's okay to cheat at sewing sometimes or do things that are lazy or perceived as bad practice or whatever. Not every project you make has to be super challenging or historically accurate. It's okay to make things slowly and just for the fun of making them. So thank you all so much for your support with this project and this collaboration. It's been really wonderful and it's meant an awful lot to me that I was able to do this. I did mention it previously, but I am hoping to do some more historical projects on this channel. And I quite like this format of making them in like a little series, so I think that's what I'm going to do going forward. I've already got an idea lined up for my next costuming project. You shall have to wait and see what that's going to be. So if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to this channel and make sure to leave me a comment letting me know which historical eras you would like me to try next. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. See you next time.